Our study in this hour will be covering the subject of the historical background of the New Testament. And that means, of course, that we're going to look at some of the secular things happening in history prior to the coming of Christ, which set the stage both of Jewish culture and the secular environment for the events of the New Testament. When Jesus came into the world, He didn't come into a vacuum. He came into a world that was in the midst of a history. History was happening for a long time before Jesus arrived here, and it's been happening ever since. And He came as an interruption to it. And in coming and interrupting history, He found history to have reached a certain state. The Jewish culture into which He came had a background that had brought it into its present condition. And at the time, they happened to be under the dominion of Rome. And Rome had a history also. And there were other nations whose histories figured into the total picture of what Israel was and the setting for Jesus' life and Paul's ministry and so forth were. So what I'm going to do is we're not going to be studying the Bible this time. We're going to study some historical backgrounds because we'll soon be getting into the life of Christ. As of Monday, in your second morning session, you'll be starting with Luke and getting into the life of Christ, and it's necessary that we get some background on that. In fact, the remainder of the classes this week will be in preparation for that, New Testament studies. There is a period of about 400 years that fell between the last book of the Old Testament and the first of the New. That is to say, from the time of Malachi, the last of the Old Testament prophets, to the time of the coming of John the Baptist and Jesus, was about 4 centuries space during which there were no prophets speaking to Israel. We certainly couldn't say God was not involved in their affairs, but there are no matters that seem to have been important enough to be recorded by prophets to become part of the Scriptures, so that we have these what are sometimes called the silent years, the 400 years, which would properly be called the intertestamental period, meaning it falls between the two testaments, between the Old Testament and the New Testament is a 400-year gap, the intertestamental period, during which, though nothing was being written that ever came to be part of our Bible, nonetheless many important things were happening to the Jewish people. And when we talk about them today, some of them are certainly every bit as fascinating as the things that are recorded in the Bible about their history. The history of the Jews during this period is fascinating. And we are going to study a bit of that today. But apparently it was not a time of God's direct dealings in such a way as to make it significant to be included in Scripture. And so God sent no prophets to Israel during this time. And when John the Baptist finally did appear and began to preach and proclaim that the kingdom of God was near, it was clear that he was breaking the silence, a prophetic silence of 400 years. He was the first prophetic voice to speak out during those centuries. And interestingly, the last prophet to have spoken had been Malachi, whose last words had been a prediction that John the Baptist would come. So the Old Testament closes with the prediction that John the Baptist would come, and the New Testament opens with John the Baptist coming. But between that prediction and its fulfillment was 400 years during which no biblical record has been made of the event. Excuse me. That does not mean the Jews were not keeping track of their history during that time, however. It's simply that there were no prophets keeping track of their history, and we do have Jewish literature and literature from other nations that we would call secular literature, which gives us information about that period. Part of that literature that contributes to our knowledge of that intertestamental period is found in the apocryphal books that the Catholics in their Bible include in the Old Testament. They're not included in our Bible because the Jews never recognized these books as Scripture, nor have Christians historically done so until a certain point, I think it was in the 16th century, when the Roman Catholics included them in their Bible and said they were Scripture. However, the apocryphal books are not as accurate as the rest of Scripture, and they don't have the marks of Scripture in other respects, and they were not quoted in the New Testament as Scripture, so we don't have really reason to accept them as Scripture, but we can, in some cases, accept them as history. For instance, the book of 1 Maccabees, which is one of the apocryphal books, is considered by most to be a historical document of the first rank. It does tell something of the historic happenings during the intertestamental period from an eyewitness view, and therefore it serves as a documentation of that period just as much as, say, Josephus serves as a documentation of first century Jewish history. So he was not writing inspired writings either. So from this and from other sources, we know something about what happened to the Jews during those 400 years. And the things that happened to them were setting the stage for the coming of Christ and of the gospel. When Malachi preached, the last of the Old Testament prophets, the Persians were in control of the world. They had sometime earlier conquered Babylon. Babylon had taken the Jews into captivity for 70 years, as you know. And then the Jews had returned, many of them had returned to Jerusalem, rebuilt the city, rebuilt the temple with Zerubbabel and Ezra and Nehemiah over a period of about 100 years. And that was the restoration period. At the end of that time, we have Malachi's prophecy uttered and then no more prophecies. And so we are left, as far as the historic setting of the Old Testament is concerned, the last setting we have is the Persian rule, which had overthrown the Babylonians. Well, after the Persian rule was the rule of the Greeks. And this was accomplished largely by Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great was born the son of Philip II of Macedon, ruler of Macedonia or of Greece. Macedonia is northern Greece. And Philip II's son, Alexander, was born in 356 BC. So about 3.5 centuries before Christ, or approximately 50 years after the close of the Old Testament. We have the birth of Alexander the Great. He only lived 33 years, and the records of his death vary. Some say he drank himself to death. Some say he died of venereal disease. Some feel like he committed suicide deliberately because at age 33 he had no more challenges. There were no more worlds to conquer. He did such great exploits in his early life. Actually, he started his military career at age 20. When Alexander was only 20 years old, he began to lead the armies of Greece against the powers that be in other regions. And through his brilliance and his strategy and his power, as a commanding officer of the Greeks, he conquered the known world within 12 years. So by the time he was age 32, there was nothing else to conquer. He was dreaming about going to India and so forth, but for one reason or another, he never did that, and he died at age 33. But not before he made a name for himself in history by becoming one of the swiftest and most impressive military genius and conquerors that history had ever seen. And through Alexander, the Persians were overthrown. And as it were, the Israel, or Palestine, which had been under Persian rule, came under Greek rule. According to Josephus, the Jewish historian, when Alexander was riding into Jerusalem to conquer that land, the high priest of the time, whose name was Jaddua, came out of the temple carrying the scrolls of the prophet Daniel and read to Alexander the Great as Alexander was riding in on his white horse. Jaddua the priest came out to meet him and read to him the passages in Daniel, chapters 8, verses 5 through 7, and so on in that chapter that talk about Alexander the Great and predict his exploits. And when Alexander saw that in fact these predictions had been fulfilled in his career, he recognized that the Jewish God was the true God. Now that didn't make him a worshiper of God. Nebuchadnezzar had the same experience many times, had to acknowledge that the Jews had the true God, but that doesn't mean they wanted to serve him. But Alexander was sufficiently impressed with the Jews to show kindness to them and show favor to them and to make them governors of all his province. He gave them many political favors and granted them religious liberty because of the impression the book Daniel made upon him. And so life under Alexander was not too bad for the Jews for those 12 years. But after Alexander died, he had no son. Well, his sons were assassinated, and so he couldn't leave the kingdom that he had conquered to his sons. And it was divided up, rather, between his 4 major generals. He had 4 generals who divided his kingdom, and 2 of them become significant in the history of Israel, because part of Alexander's kingdom had been the realm of Egypt. And one of his generals named Ptolemy, whose name I will write down for you, Ptolemy. Ptolemy was one of Alexander's 4 generals who divided his empire, and he took Egypt as his portion. Now, by the way, after Alexander's death, these generals fought against each other extensively, each of them wanting to gain the whole empire. But none of them was powerful enough to overthrow the others, so they finally, by mutual agreement, divided it up. So Ptolemy got Egypt, which is obviously south of Palestine, and another one of them, Seleucus, took Syria, with its headquarters in Antioch, and that, of course, is to the north of Palestine. Now, these 2 generals became the rulers. These are the 4 generals who divided up are sometimes called the Didakoi. I'm not sure what the word actually means, but these 2 guys became rulers over Egypt and Syria. And the successors of Ptolemy, the rulers after him who took control of the Egyptian empire, were called the Ptolemies. The successors of Seleucus, who after his death took the reign over Syria, were called Seleucids, or the Seleucid dynasty, and some of them were named Seleucus, and some of them were named Antiochus, because the capital of Syria was Antioch, and so some of them called themselves by the name Antiochus, and some Seleucus. So in the southern kingdom of Egypt, the kings were called the Ptolemies for a number of years, and in the northern area of Syria, they were the Seleucids, or sometimes their names were Antiochus. There was Seleucus the first, Seleucus the second, Seleucus the third, and so forth. There was also Antiochus the first, Antiochus the second, Antiochus the third, Antiochus the fourth, and so forth. These were the rulers up in northern Syria. Now, the reason these are significant to us is because they bordered on the north and the south the land of Israel. Now, the Jews were, of course, trying to mind their own business most of the time, trying to live out their religious liberty and worship their God without bothering anyone. They weren't going about to convert the world as God told them to do, but they just wanted to carve out a place for themselves of safety there in their own land. However, they never seemed to find that security, because these 2 kings, Ptolemy and Seleucus, were at war with each other. And both of them wanted to control Palestine, for one thing, so they could exact revenues from that property to help support their financial empire, and also because it was a good buffer zone for each of them against the other. Whoever could control Palestine would have a good buffer to protect his empire from attack from the other side. And as it turned out, the Ptolemies were more powerful than the Seleucids in the beginning of this historical period. So for about 120 years, Palestine was under the Ptolemies, under Egypt. And life for the Jews under the Ptolemies was relatively nice. They didn't have a bad time. The Ptolemies did not persecute them much. And so life was relatively peaceful under the Ptolemies. That is, under the Egyptian rule. That was for a period of about 120 years. That is from the year 323 BC to the year 198 BC. So from 323 to 198, about 120 years, 122, 23 years, Palestine was under the control of the Ptolemies of Egypt. That dynasty, by the way, lasted 300 years, the Ptolemaic dynasty. And the last member of the Ptolemy dynasty was Cleopatra. And she died in the year 30 BC, and that ended that dynasty. So you've, of course, heard of Cleopatra before. She was the last member of that particular dynasty. Now, what happened in 198 BC was that one of the Seleucid kings, Antiochus III was his name, of Syria, Antiochus III, so it's clear that he was several generations down the line from the original Seleucus. He won Palestine away from Egypt. In a war between Syria and Egypt, Antiochus III beat Ptolemy and captured Palestine as his control. So Palestine came from then on under the control of the Seleucid dynasty, under Syria. Now, life was not easy for the Jews under the Seleucids for the most part, as it had been under the Ptolemies. The Ptolemies had been kind to the Jews. The Syrians were not kind to the Jews. And It was under the Seleucid dynasty that some very significant things took place. Now, most of the time, the Seleucids and the Ptolemies were not interested in the people of Israel per se, just they wanted to maintain control of that land. And yet, sometimes the Seleucid kings would come down and do mean things, cruel things, to the Jews. And one of those who did so particularly was named Antiochus IV. And he's very significant. He is, in fact, the little horn of Daniel chapter 8, who was such a terror that was predicted by Daniel, who would come and do horrible things and persecute dreadfully the Jews. He is also the willful king of Daniel chapter 11 that predicted what Antiochus IV would do. Antiochus IV also had a nickname he gave himself called Epiphanes. Antiochus Epiphanes. E-P-I-P-H-A-N-E-S. Antiochus Epiphanes means the illustrious one. Antiochus the illustrious. Now, he was kind of a cruel dictator type, and he really did some mean things to the Jews, and as it turns out, he had some political enemies, and they made a play on words. They changed his name in their own speech to Epiphanes, I think it's this way, which means the madman. So he called himself Antiochus Epiphanes, the illustrious one. His enemies called him Antiochus Epiphanes, which means Antiochus the madman. And he was a bit of a madman in many respects. One thing in particular that affected the Jews was while they were under his control, Antiochus Epiphanes made a raid on Egypt, hoping to annex Egypt as part of his empire. But the Romans, who at that time were growing in power as a world force, did not want to see Syria become any stronger. Obviously, Syria and Rome were rivals, and Egypt was another rival. There were all these different powers. None of them really exercised world control at this time. And Rome was ambitious and wanted to gain world control. Therefore, Rome saw it as a threat for Syria to gain control of Egypt as well, because that would make the Syrian Empire that much stronger. So the Roman fleet sailed to intercept Antiochus Epiphanes as he was marching on Egypt. And what actually happened is the Roman envoy drew a circle around Antiochus Epiphanes on the ground and said, "You cannot step out of this circle until you agree to withdraw your troops and go back to Syria." Now, Antiochus had spent in his earlier life 12 years as a hostage in Rome. He had learned to respect the power of Rome, and he didn't want to engage in full-scale war against Rome, so he honored the request. He acquiesced to the demand, I should say, and he backed down and he went back through Palestine to Syria. But he was in a huff because, of course, his plans to conquer Egypt had been spoiled by the intervention of the Romans, and he was very upset about that. And so he went into Jerusalem and slew 40,000 Jews just out of spite. Well, I should say it wasn't just out of spite. Another thing had happened, and maybe I should have brought this up earlier. There were some other reasons he was mad at the Jews. Let me put it this way. When he came to power, when Antiochus Epiphanes came to power and had control of Palestine, he took the priesthood away from the high priest. During this period of the Seleucid rule, there had been two parties among the Jews. One party was pro-Egyptian, or pro-Ptolemies, and one party was pro-Seleucid, pro-Syria. The house of Onias was pro-Egyptian. These were two political parties in Palestine at the time when the Ptolemies lost control of Palestine. There was the house of Onias, which was a party that was pro-Egyptian, and then there was the house of Tobias, which was pro-Syria. So the house of Tobias was loyal to the Seleucids. The house of Onias wanted to be under the Ptolemies again, under Egypt. Now, it was Onias III, obviously pro-Egyptian, who was the high priest in Jerusalem when Antiochus Epiphanes came to power. And since Onias was pro-Egypt, Antiochus didn't want to leave him in the priesthood, so he replaced Onias with Onias' own brother, whose name was Jason, I believe it was, yeah. So Antiochus Epiphanes axed Onias III and put his brother Jason in the priesthood, okay? Now this is something that happened before Antiochus Epiphanes tried to go and annex Egypt. Now after this happened, after the Roman fleet thwarted Antiochus's plans and schemes on Egypt, he was returning to his own homeland of Syria, and he passed through Palestine. And what had happened is while Antiochus was in Egypt, Onias, I'm losing something here. I'm so sorry. This is confusing enough without me botching it up. What had happened, another thing had happened. After Jason was appointed, another guy offered Antiochus more money for the priesthood. And his name was Menelaus. I forgot about him, I'm sorry. This is not an area where I'm an expert on this part of history, but Menelaus, who was not even of a priestly family, at least Onias and Jason were priests of the house of Levi and of the house of Aaron. Menelaus was not even of the priestly family, but he offered to pay higher tribute to Antiochus than Jason was paying if Antiochus would put him in the priesthood. So basically, Antiochus Epiphanes sold the priesthood to Menelaus. Now, what happened when Antiochus marched on Egypt and the Romans thwarted his plans? Jason, who was in hiding, in exile actually, in Transjordan, in Perea, heard a false rumor that Antiochus had been killed in Egypt. Now, Antiochus hadn't been killed, but he heard that he had. And since it was Antiochus who had put in Menelaus, and the people didn't like Menelaus, the pious Jews resented the fact that the priesthood would be given to the highest bidder and sold like a piece of merchandise. So Jason came back and rallied the Jews against himself and ousted Menelaus and took the priesthood back. So Jason, thinking that Antiochus was dead, ousted Menelaus and then took the priesthood back. But to his chagrin, Antiochus was not dead. And when Antiochus came back toward Syria, he found Jason in the priesthood and found that Menelaus had been ousted, and Antiochus interpreted this as an act of treason and a revolt against his authority. So what he did is he slaughtered 40,000 Jews, took women and children slaves. He burned the city. He had his armies ransack the temple, and he reinstated Menelaus and ousted Jason. So Menelaus came back to power again. And that was the first real bad time of conflict between the Jews in Palestine and Antiochus, but that wasn't the worst or the last. This happened, by the way, I think it was the year 170, it was 170 BC, all that happened. This thwarted attempt on Egypt by Antiochus Epiphanes. Now, there was happening from the time of the Seleucids on a reculturization in Palestine. The Jews, of course, had always had a strong Jewish culture based on the laws of Moses. But Alexander the Great, in his lifetime, had sought to Hellenize the world. Hellenize means to bring the Greek culture and the Greek language and so forth to the whole world. And Alexander did a great deal in Hellenizing the world, but Judea, or Palestine, was resistant to Hellenization because they had their strong Jewish culture, which was so different than the Greek. They didn't want to conform, which is good. That's to their credit. And Alexander failed to get Palestine Hellenized. However, the Seleucids sought to enforce Hellenization. And there were some Jews, some liberal Jews in Palestine who agreed with Hellenization, and they allowed the Greek culture to come in, to the point that this is what actually happened. They built a Greek gymnasium in the city of Jerusalem with a racetrack for running races, and Jewish boys would exercise and work out nude on these racetracks in the Greek fashion. The Greek runners would run nude. It was the custom. And the Jewish boys, accepting the Greek culture and so forth, as these Greek games were beginning to be played in Jerusalem, the Jewish boys partaking of it were doing it nude, which was something that the more pious Jews obviously objected to. That was indecency. Furthermore, these races were opened with invocations to the Greek gods. Right there in Jerusalem, this Greek racetrack and gymnasium was built, and the games there in Jerusalem were opened by prayers to the Greek gods. And there were even priests who were attending these things. Now, there was a group of Jews who objected to all this Hellenization, and they were called the Hasidim. You recognize the letters I-M makes it plural. Hasid means pious. The Hasidim means the pious ones. They were roughly equivalent to what we would call the Puritans. They objected to all of this compromise of the Jewish way of life. And they wanted to enforce the pure Jewish ways and not allow all of this paganism to come into their culture. In a sense, there are many parallels to this period of Jewish history to our Western world today. Our Western world was once greatly affected by Christian ideas and Christian culture, but there's now very much worldly culture creeping in, even into the church. And this would be an interesting preaching point, to tell you the truth, because the Hellenization of Israel involved the Greek sports being brought in, with all the Greek deities and everything. It involved bringing in immorality. Greek clothing styles were brought in, and the Jews started wearing Greek clothing styles. A Greek theater was brought in, and the Greek forms of entertainment were brought in. In other words, the world invaded Palestine. The pagan world invaded Palestine, and most of the Jews welcomed it. And they attended the theater, and they attended the sporting events, and they wore the Greek clothing and so forth. They just basically allowed their distinctive culture to degenerate, and they became like other nations. That's essentially what we can see happening to a great degree in the church also. The pagan forms of entertainment, the pagan athletic events, the pagan clothing styles, the pagan morals and so forth have come in, and the church has basically welcomed them in. The church doesn't want to be old-fashioned. The church wants to keep up with the times. And so the Hellenizers were a prevailing, powerful group of Jews who accepted the Greek culture in Palestine. But the Hasidim were the Puritans of the time who says, hey, throw this stuff out. This doesn't belong to us. We're God's people. We're not supposed to be like the world. And so there were these pious ones, the Hasidim, and there was a tremendous conflict between the Hasidim and the Hellenizers. And by the way, the Hasidim Jews of that period developed into the Pharisees of Jesus' time. The Pharisees, the word Pharisee means separated ones, holy ones, separated ones. And they were a class of Jews that evolved out of these early Hasidim, and also a more radical class of Jews developed out of the Hasidim, and who became the Essenes, who were more radically Puritan than the Pharisees were. And they went out and lived in a commune out in the wilderness and bathed themselves 40 times a day and did all kinds of strange things and were totally, chaste and celibate and so forth. And they were a radical right-wing Jewish cult. But the Pharisees of Jesus' day came from these Hasidim of 170 years earlier. Okay, now, all this Hellenization was taking place, and the Jewish culture was deteriorating into just another worldly culture. Only the Hasidim were raising their voices against that, which means that the group that the Pharisees grew out of was relatively godly, the original ones were. And a couple of years after this problem between Antiochus Epiphanes and the Jews, when Jason came back in and Antiochus, ransacked the temple and stuff. After Antiochus did some of these bad things, he went on home to Syria. This was all in 170 BC. 2 years later, in 168 BC, Antiochus sent his general Apollonius with 22,000 troops back to Palestine to do more damage. Why he was stirred up on this occasion, I'm not sure. I think he was just upset that the Jews were resisting Hellenization, that some of them were, and that there was still remnants of Jewish resistance, pockets of resistance against Hellenization there in Palestine, and this enraged Antiochus, so he sent his general Apollonius and 22,000 troops down to Palestine to outlaw Judaism and to enforce paganism. And on that occasion, they looted They tore down the houses and the walls of the city. They burned the city. They did as much damage as they could. They murdered men, and they took women and children captive as slaves, and they did all kinds of horrible things, including enforcing paganism. They made it mandatory by law to offer sacrifices to the pagan gods. They made it punishable by death to circumcise your children, to observe the Sabbath, to observe the Jewish festivals, or even to possess a copy of the Scriptures. Under this new arrangement, that when Antiochus came in with these armies, it became a capital offense to own part of the Scriptures, and many scrolls were burned at that time. And it was a capital offense even to circumcise your children or to keep Sabbath, which means, of course, the Jews were in a really hard spot because God required them to circumcise their children and keep Sabbath or else come under His judgment. So it was a choice between the judgment of God or the judgment of man. What do you choose? Be faithful to God, be faithful unto death, or betray God's ways and live? Well, we can appreciate the difficulty the Jews would have, perhaps only mentally. There are some Christians, of course, who at various times have had to make similar choices. But this is what came down. Now, among other things, when Antiochus' people came in 168 BC, the temple, the Jewish temple, was desecrated by the erection of an altar to Zeus. An altar to Zeus was put up in the Jerusalem temple, and unclean animals, including pigs, were sacrificed on it right there in the temple. In addition to this, temple prostitution was instituted right there in the temple of God, the temple that had been rebuilt by Zerubbabel some 300 years earlier or so. Now, temple prostitution was practiced in almost all the ancient religions. The Canaanite religions, the Greek religion, the Roman religions, almost all of them had temple prostitutes. Part of their worship of their false gods included sleeping with these prostitutes, and sometimes in some societies even sacrificing your children and then sleeping with a prostitute was one of the most sacred things you could do. Well, obviously this is as far removed from anything the Jews or God's people would sanction as you can get, and yet these very things were brought into the temple in Jerusalem by the decree of Antiochus. So the Jerusalem at that time was really in a hard place. The godly Hasidim were put to death by the thousands because they would keep Sabbath. They wouldn't fight back on the Sabbath. They did fight back other days of the week, but because they kept Sabbath, they were executed without offering any resistance because they felt like on Sabbath you can't lift a sword, you can't fight. So these Hasidim were just slaughtered by the thousands during this period of time. However, something very heroic happened and something very exciting, really, when you think about it. And this is part of it, which is perhaps as interesting as almost any of the Bible stories. In a little city, a little town called Modin, in the year 167 BC, there was a Syrian agent under Antiochus, an official agent, was sent to this village to enforce the offering of pagan sacrifices. And there was an old priest in that town named Mattathias. And he had 5 sons. This Syrian official came to Mattathias and set up an altar for a pagan god and commanded the priest Mattathias to sacrifice to this pagan god on this altar. Mattathias refused to do so. And another bystander, another Jew standing in the crowd, stepped forward and offered to do so instead. And Mattathias took a sword and killed the man who volunteered to offer the sacrifice and also killed the officer. And he realized that meant war. And so he and his sons, his 5 sons, after he killed this Jew who was going to offer the sacrifice to the pagan deity, and after he killed the officer, he and his 5 sons fled into the mountains. And there were certain other Hasidim, holy, pious Jews, who of course were sympathetic toward this movement. They hated the Syrians anyway, and they resorted to Mattathias and his sons out in the mountains, and they formed together a guerrilla band that waged guerrilla warfare against the Syrians who were occupying Palestine at that time so successfully. Their exploits were so successful that the Syrians were on the run. And finally, within a few years, within 3.5 years, the Maccabeans, as they came to be called, because after Mattathias died, his son Judas took over the lead. And after Judas died, it was his son Jonathan, that is Mattathias' son Jonathan, took the lead. And after Jonathan died, Simon, his other son, now all these boys were sons of Mattathias. It pays to have a lot of sons, because they got picked off. One of the sons gets killed in battle. The next son steps into the ranks. See, he gets picked off. He's got another son ready to step in. Tremendous. Great strategy. Judas, the son of Mattathias, was nicknamed Maccabeus. And Maccabeus means the hammer. No one knows why he was called that. Actually, some have theorized, and this is serious, some have theorized it was the shape of his head that gave him that title. But others feel probably it had more to do with the forcefulness with which he attacked the enemy, like a hammer smashing him. But anyway, Maccabeus means the hammer, and it was a nickname given to Judas. And this is called the Maccabean revolt, when Mattathias and his sons waged this guerrilla warfare against the Syrians for a period of 3.5 years and actually drove the Syrians out and overcame them. Well, part of the reason they were able to do that is because Syria and Antiochus Epiphanes were having some other troubles on another border against Rome. They were fighting some other battles. They couldn't put all their armies down into Palestine to quell this rebellion. So Antiochus' forces were spread so thin that the Maccabean revolt was successful and drove the Syrians out and won Jewish independence again for the first time in centuries. The Jews had temporary, very temporary independence. And Judas was killed in battle, as was his father Mattathias. However, when they won independence under Judas, Jonathan, who was the leader of the band, became the high priest. Now remember, this is a priestly family. Mattathias was the priest. And Jonathan installed himself as the high priest in Jerusalem. And under his direction, the walls of the city that had been burned down began to be rebuilt and so forth. After Jonathan's death, his brother Simon took the position of high priest and also made himself king. Now this position of king that Simon possessed was never ordained by God. God had said that only people of the tribe of Judah could be king and not people of the tribe of Levi, as these were. But anyway, Simon made himself priest and king temporarily. But in doing so, he entered into a political conflict that became very ugly. And the next few years of what was called the Hasmonean dynasty, and I'll put this up here, Hasmonean dynasty. Now, that word, Hasmonean, is taken from the great-grandfather of Mattathias was named Hashmon, or Hasmon. And for some reason, the name of the whole family was called the Hasmoneans, because Mattathias' great-grandfather was named Hasmon, or Hashmon. And so this family was called the Hasmonean dynasty. If you read history books of the period, they'll talk about the Hasmoneans, and that's who it's talking about, the family of Mattathias, the Maccabeans, same family. But in the days of Simon, when he became high priest and declared himself king in Jerusalem, suddenly there were a lot of other guys who wanted his job. And he ended up being assassinated by his son-in-law. And there were others who fought it out over this position. Everyone wanted to be high priest because that also meant king. And the priesthood during this time, the Hasmonean priesthood, became a political power. Now remember, until this time in history, the priesthood was not supposed to be a political organization. The priesthood was supposed to be the people who offered the sacrifices and led the people in the worship of God. The Jews had a separate monarchy under David's family before, but since the Jews had no more monarchy, the priest was in the position to stick himself in a government position, which he did. And during this time, the priesthood became a politically powerful organization. And just 150 years later, we find that the Sanhedrin, in the days of Jesus, was the ruling body in Israel. Even though they were under the Roman tribute, the Sanhedrin was a body of priestly people of this family who had political power. And it was from this group that the Sadducean party grew. The early members of this family were Hasmoneans. And we know from the Hasmoneans grew the Pharisees and the Essenes. But later on, as they became more political, the priests became more political, they developed into more what came to be known as the Sadducees, which were the politically minded liberal Jews of Jesus' day who held the political power. They ruled the Sanhedrin. And the high priest Caiaphas and Annas in the days of Jesus were Sadducees, of the Sadducee party. And they were just after a long line of these priests fighting it out for the top. Well, the fighting didn't go on forever. Eventually, this fighting that went on was stabilized by the intrusion of the Romans. Because all this while these guys were fighting it out among themselves, who was going to be the ruler in Palestine, other significant things were happening in the world, namely the rise of the Roman Empire. And Pompey, a Roman general, came in and conquered Palestine, basically, put Palestine under tribute in the year 63 BC. So about 100 years, approximately 100 years after the Maccabean revolt, the Romans came in and put an end to all this political intrigue and confusion in Palestine by the coming in of Pompey. He intervened in these power struggles among the Jews in 63 BC. Later, he himself was defeated by Julius Caesar. Pompey was overthrown by Julius Caesar, who is fairly famous because we're familiar with the play by Shakespeare about Caesar, in 48 BC. In 48 BC, Julius Caesar took control of Rome, and therefore, by extension, control of Palestine. Later, in the year 44 BC, Julius Caesar was murdered by Cassius and Brutus. As again we know from Shakespeare's play, but we know it from secular history. So Cassius and Brutus murdered Julius Caesar, and out of the power struggle that followed in Rome, Mark Antony, became the powerful figure of the Roman Empire, and he had a relationship with Cleopatra, who was the last of the Ptolemy dynasty in Egypt. And Mark Antony was later defeated in battle by Octavian in the year 31 BC. Now, this brings us right up to the New Testament era. 31 BC, just 30 years before Christ, or so, maybe 25 years before Christ, really. Octavian became the first emperor of Rome by conquering Antony and Cleopatra. So, after all of these power struggles in Rome ended, they ended actually with Octavian becoming emperor, and that ended the period of expansion for Rome. And of course, since 63 BC, Israel had been under the control of Rome. And a new condition in the world began with Octavian. Octavian had no more power struggles. He controlled the empire with a strong hand. And the world that he sought to conquer was now conquered. So he was not expanding his borders. Instead, there prevailed throughout the empire what was called the Pax Romana, which just is Latin for peace, the peace of Rome. Pax Romana. The Roman peace, really. And the Pax Romana meant there's no more war going on. Now, this was just very shortly before the birth of Jesus. And the Pax Romana was a condition that prevailed for many centuries, or a number of centuries, and therefore it means that Jesus was born and the apostles preached during a period of time where there was relative political stability in the world. The Roman power had subdued the rest of the world. For instance, if Jesus had been born in the apostles during the Hasmonean dynasty and the power struggles there, there would have been a lot of things to detract from simply preaching the gospel, like staying alive and looking out for the new guy who just forced his way to the top and so forth. Whereas under the Pax Romana, life was fairly complacent, life was fairly peaceful, and the apostles and Jesus were able to speak plainly and of course travel. Jesus didn't travel much, but the apostles traveled widely. It was, of course, under the Roman Empire that roads, highly refined roads, paved roads were constructed throughout the empire. Is where we get the expression, all roads lead to Rome. The Roman roads were proverbial. And of course, these became the highways over which the apostles traveled from one part of the empire to another. The Roman roads were valuable to the apostles because we can't appreciate this so much because we have highways that cut right through mountain ranges and everything now. We have tunnels that go through mountains for a period of sometimes miles through. And to us, mountains don't present a big problem, especially if we fly in airplanes. Travel from one place to another, it doesn't present the same kind of obstacles it once did. But if you're ever out in an area where there aren't paved roads, or where there aren't any graded roads at all, just walking through the mountains and think, at one time this whole area we live in was like this, you know? Imagine trying to drive a car or even a wagon pulled by horses over some of these ravines that are hard enough just to walk through. Travel in the world before we had earth-moving equipment and things like that was very difficult. And yet when the Romans carved out and paved out roads from one place to another, of course it made travel, it was a revolutionary development for travel throughout the empire. They still couldn't fly like we can, but they could travel much more quickly and efficiently overland places. And so this again set the stage for the preaching of the gospel through the whole world. If Jesus had come 100 years earlier, the carrying of the gospel to the whole world would have been much more difficult over the land areas. But the Roman roads helped to change that. By the way, another thing that was going on, way back in the days of Alexander, part of his Hellenizing process of the world was to establish Greek, and he developed his own form of Greek. It's called Koine Greek, which means common Greek, as the world language, the universal language of the empire. This was back in Alexander's day. So Greek was still spoken throughout the whole Roman period. Now, the advantage of that, of course, to the gospel was that Jesus didn't have to have a whole bunch of bilingual or multilingual disciples to get the word out to the whole world. The whole world spoke one language. Well, they had other languages too. They had their own provincial languages and so forth, but they all spoke Greek at least as a second language. So the New Testament was written in Greek and immediately could be read and understood by every known culture at the time. So that it was these things that were developments in the secular world, the spread of Koine Greek as a world language, the Pax Romana, the Roman peace, which made travel from one country to another more safe, the roads that made it more swift, all came up to set the stage for the spread of the gospel. Now, Octavian was the Caesar. Octavian was the emperor, last we heard, in 31 BC, and he called himself Caesar the August, or Augustus. Caesar Augustus. You might remember that name from Luke chapter 2, which says, there went a decree from Caesar Augustus that all the world should be taxed, and Mary and Joseph had to go to Bethlehem because of that decree. It was Caesar Augustus. Octavian was his real name, and Augustus was his nickname, but he was the Caesar when Jesus was born. And he reigned over Rome from from 27 BC. 31 BC is when he finally defeated all his enemies, but from 27 BC to 14 AD. So, in other words, when Jesus was about 15 or 20 years old, depending on when Jesus was born, we don't quite know. But when Jesus was between 15 and 20 years old, Octavian died and left his kingdom, he left the empire, to Tiberius. And Tiberius was the Caesar when Jesus began his ministry. That might be U.S., I'm not sure. It might be, yeah, I think it is. Over that day. Tiberius Caesar reigned from 14 AD to, I think, 37, yeah. So the whole from the time that Jesus began to minister until on through his death, Jesus' whole adult life was spent under the reign of Tiberius Caesar in Rome, although he never met him, of course, because the Caesar of Rome didn't come to Palestine very frequently for anything. After Tiberius came Caligula. I mention these because all of them have something to do with the Bible story. From 37 to, I think, only 39. No, he was longer than that. Sorry about that. 41. From 37 to 41 AD was Caligula. Now, he's not mentioned in the Bible, but it's clear that the apostles were out and about during his reign, doing their mission. And an interesting thing about Caligula that is not found in the Bible but in secular history, Caligula was called a madman by his subjects. And he did some radical, stupid things. And one thing he did was he decreed that an image of himself should be set up in the Holy of Holies of the Jerusalem temple, and the Jews would have to worship him. However, he died before that order could be carried out, so it never was done. But he did order it that the Jews should set up an image of Caligula in the temple, an abomination of desolation. But as I said, it didn't get carried out. The next emperor was Claudius, from 41 to, I think, to 54. Claudius, he is mentioned in the Bible. In the book of Acts, I think it's chapter 18, Aquila and Priscilla, when they met Paul, it is chapter 18, at the beginning of that chapter, Priscilla and Aquila met Paul in the city of Corinth. And they had recently come there from Rome because Claudius had commanded that all the Jews leave Rome. That's what it says in Acts 18. We have a secular source. A Roman historian recorded that Claudius banished all the Jews from Rome because of insurrections and riots that were there instigated by someone named Chrestus. This is from a secular Roman source, not from the Bible. The Bible mentions him and mentions this fact that the Jews were expelled, and Aquila and Priscilla, Paul's friends, were among those Jews who left Rome because of this expulsion. But in secular sources, we're told that Claudius expelled all the Jews from Rome because of riots that were caused at the instigation of someone named Chrestus, spelled Chrestus. Now, the Roman name for Christ is Christus, spelled Christus. In other words, just the same as Christus, only with a different vowel. And many people believe that the historian who recorded this statement about Christus mistakenly used the name Christus, but was really talking about Christus, that the information had been conveyed to him wrongly, and that, in fact, the reason that Claudius expelled the Jews from Rome is because the Jewish Christians were always having conflicts with the non-Jewish Christians. With the Jewish non-Christians. So the Jews were fighting among themselves over the issue of Christ. That is at least how most historians understand the reference in the Roman historian who mentions this. But Claudius expelled the Jews from Rome for a period of time. After Claudius, from 54 to 68, was Nero. He is the Caesar to whom Paul appealed. He appealed to Caesar, as we'll find in the book of Acts, and that was Caesar Nero. Nero eventually beheaded Paul, crucified Peter upside down, and had a general persecution of Christians that was one of the bloodiest up to that time that had ever come on the Christians. He was considered to be really a demon. The early Christians called him the beast. And then after Nero was Vespasian, who is not mentioned in the Bible, but was the one who was ruling when Jerusalem was overthrown in 70 AD. Vespasian attacked Jerusalem, but he retreated when he heard of conflicts in Rome, in the power struggle there, and he went back to Rome and became the emperor, Vespasian did, and sent his son Titus back with the armies to conquer Jerusalem, which he did in 70 AD. He's not mentioned in the Bible, but Vespasian was the next one, and then there was also Domitian. Domitian, spelled D-O-M-I-T-I-A-N, Domitian, was the emperor probably when the book of Revelation was written, many believe. And he's apparently the emperor who banished John to the island of Patmos where the book of Revelation was written. He reigned from 81 to 96 AD. So these are some of the Roman Empire emperors whose reigns set the secular stage for the New Testament story. Now there's one other thing I should mention. When Augustus became Caesar, of course he became the ruler to whom the Jews in Palestine would have to ultimately answer. And he set up a man in power as king in Jerusalem. Now there had been no real official king in Jerusalem. Of course there's some Hasmoneans who called themselves kings before that, but there had not really been a king, an authorized king in Jerusalem until Augustus set up a man named Herod, also known as Herod the Great. In 40 BC, Augustus said to Herod, "It's all yours." Trouble is, the Jews didn't like Herod. And the Jews are feisty people. And they fought with Herod. They fought tooth and nail with Herod before he finally, with his superior military force, took control and in 37 BC began to rule in Jerusalem. It took 3 years of fighting with the Jews for Herod to get the throne there, although in 40 BC Augustus had appointed it to him. The reason the Jews didn't like Herod, there are a lot of good reasons. First of all, he wasn't Jewish. He was Edomite. In fact, he's the last known Edomite in history. The prophet Obadiah had predicted that the Edomites would be totally exterminated and cease to be a people, and that has happened. Herod and his family were the last Edomites known in history. So the Edomites were historic enemies of the Jews, so his background, gave him two strikes against him from the beginning. The Jews didn't like him for that reason. Also, he wasn't exactly a lovely character. He was a ruthless, though he was a very shrewd ruler, and politically, he is remembered as being a very wise ruler. But he was ruthless and insane. He died of intestinal cancer finally, but he was insane for the last years of his life. In fact, he murdered 2 of his own wives and 3 of his own sons because he suspected they were trying to get the throne from him and so forth. And Caesar Augustus actually said about Herod, it's safer to be one of Herod's pigs than one of his sons. And that was a play on words because in the Greek, pig is similar to the word for son. So we can't appreciate the play on words in English in the translation, but he basically said it's safer to be one of Herod's pigs than one of his sons because he kills his sons. And he killed 3 of his sons that we know of and 2 of his wives. He wasn't a very nice guy. He's the one that was ruling in Jerusalem when Jesus was born. And he is the one, according to Matthew's Gospel, that ordered the execution of all the babies in Bethlehem under 2 years old in order to wipe out the threat that he perceived in Jesus. Jesus escaped it because an angel intervened in the situation and told Joseph and Mary to take the baby to Egypt, which they did. But probably several hundred babies were murdered by this man's ruthlessness, usually called the slaughter of the innocents. Another example of this man's ruthlessness was that when he was dying of cancer and he knew he was dying, he knew that his wickedness had not endeared him to his subjects and that they would not moan or mourn for his death. And so before his death, he had arrested and incarcerated 1,000 of the most noble and chief citizens of Jerusalem. The most beloved and honorable men of Jerusalem, 1,000 of them he arrested and put in prison. And he gave orders to his servants that when he died, they should execute those men. And his reasoning was, he knew no one would mourn his death. But if he executed all these men, he knew people would be mourning at the time of his death, which would be some consolation to him. That's the kind of madman he was. As it turned out, his orders were not carried out. When he died, his servants didn't love him either, and they let these guys go. So it wasn't carried out, but he wished for it to be. And so he was a bloodthirsty guy, and he was a real insecure character. I've read a lot about Herod, and he was just really an insecure guy, but he was a shrewd politician. Now, one of the things he did in attempting to consolidate the Jews under him was he contributed great amounts of government money to the enhancing and embellishing of the temple. The temple had, of course, been burned down some 700 years earlier by the Babylonians. And in the days of Zerubbabel, the temple had been rebuilt. That's back in the book of Ezra. We read about it. And so for 500 years at this time, the temple had been rebuilt, but it had been a shabby kind of a temple. Zerubbabel didn't have the budget Solomon had had. Solomon had built the original, and Solomon had taxed the people heavily, and it was Solomon's temple was one of the 7 wonders of the world because of the budget he had. Zerubbabel had less of a budget, and his temple never was very glorious. In fact, the old men who saw Solomon's temple and also saw Zerubbabel's temple wept when they saw Zerubbabel's temple because it seemed a small thing to them. It says in the book of Haggai, it seemed to them inglorious because Zerubbabel's temple wasn't very beautiful. However, Zerubbabel's temple was still standing when Herod became king, and he made it one of his civic projects to put a lot of money into embellishing the temple. And he brought in a lot of gold and marble, and actually the temple became so beautiful under Herod's improvements that he made. And he wasn't even Jewish by religion. He didn't care about the temple. It was a political move to make the Jews more accepting of him as a person. But he made it so beautiful that there was a saying among the Jews that if you haven't seen Herod's temple, you've seen nothing beautiful. And it was a beautiful thing, apparently. You remember when Jesus and his disciples walked out of the temple in Matthew chapter 24, that the disciples were just commenting at the beautiful marble stones and everything of the temple. And it was a wonder. They'd seen it all their lives, and yet it still was breathtaking. And Herod is best remembered among Christians and Jews, as far as anything positive he did, as being the one who embellished the temple. And the temple that Jesus ministered in is this temple that Herod had embellished. It's sometimes referred to as Herod's temple. Sometimes we speak of there being 3 temples, Solomon's, Zerubbabel's, and Herod's, where in fact there were really only 2. Solomon's, which was burned down by the Babylonians, then Zerubbabel's temple, which Herod embellished. But his embellishments and the money he put into fixing it up and remodeling it was so significant that it's practically like a 3rd temple. And that was the temple that was burned down by the Romans later in 70 AD when the Jews revolted. Well, that gives you something of the historic background of the intertestamental period and the political situation when Jesus came. And with that, it's time for us to close.